Good morning and welcome back to UCI Mind's monthly Facebook Live series, Ask the Doc, Alzheimer's Research Today. I'm Chelsea Cox. I'm the Associate Director of Education for UCI Mind, which is one of 32 congressionally designated Alzheimer's disease research centers across the country, and the only center right here in Orange County on UC Irvine campus. We are a collection of over 100 faculty, staff, and trainees who have dedicated their lives to solving Alzheimer's disease and related disorders. And in this series, we aim to bring the experts to you to answer your questions about the current state of Alzheimer's research. This is episode 8 of our series, and today we're going to discuss what researchers have learned from brain donations. And I am joined by Dr. Ed Monuki today. Welcome, Dr. Monuki.
Thank you for having me, Chelsea.
Thank you for your time. Dr. Monuki is a neuropathologist, meaning that he specializes in the diagnosis of brain disease by examining postmortem tissue. And his research aims to increase understanding of an understudied tissue known as the choroid plexus in an effort to improve treatments and therapies for brain diseases such as Alzheimer's. Dr. Monuki received his medical and doctoral degrees from UC San Diego, and he currently serves as professor and Warren L. Bostic Chair of Pathology for the UCI School of Medicine. I see a few of you have joined us today. Thank you very much to those who are joining us live. If this is your first time with us for this series, the way it works is it's an open Q&A between you and our guest expert, today being Dr. Ed Monuki. And I'll get us started by asking Dr. Monuki a few warm-up questions, and then as you have questions that come up, go ahead and type them in the comments box, and Dr. Monuki will answer as many questions as he can and as he has time for. But please do remember that whatever you post will be visible to others and linked to your name. So do please post responsibly. Okay, so to get us started, Dr. Monuki, I first wanted to ask a few questions about the brain donation process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So why might someone choose to donate their brain to science when they pass away, and how would they go about arranging that type of decision?
Yeah, it's a great question, a great way to start. Thank you all for joining this morning also. So why would someone or their family members kind of choose to donate? I think there's a lot of different reasons that might be the case. One of them is sort of, I guess I would say, the clinical part of it, which is just to be sure about the diagnosis.
Okay.
So it's still the case that to be sure that someone has Alzheimer's disease, that it requires an examination of the brain. Okay. After someone passes away. So that's still the case. So often for a family, for resolution, just to be sure about the diagnosis, maybe to assess the chances that they themselves or members of the family, the children, grandchildren, what kind of risk they may have for the disease as well. So that there's that clinical side of it. Mm-hmm. I think the other aspect of it is more the generous spirit of it, which is to help understand the disease, to contribute to the research process. And one of the things that's sort of special about the human brain compared, you hear a lot about people studying Alzheimer's disease in other animal models, particularly things like mouse models. But the mouse brain is really, really small, and so you can only do so much on a mouse brain. Mm-hmm. The human brain is pretty big, and we only need a little part of it to make the diagnosis.
Okay.
And so really someone's brain donation can contribute to literally hundreds of different studies. Wow. So it's really not just contributing to a single study. And so it really is a very precious gift to not only the family, but also to the rest of society.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned that it is true then that examining brain tissue after a person passes away is really the only way to know for certain whether they had Alzheimer's disease, right, or another type of dementia. Now, but people are often given a diagnosis while they're alive clinically.
Yes.
So how often, I guess, is the clinical diagnosis different from a neuropathological diagnosis?
That's a great question also. In the field, we talk about concordance rates. How often is the clinical diagnosis while a person is alive? How often does that match up with what the neuropathologist sees after the person passes away? And we know now, partly because of the generosity of past people donating their brains, that there is a discordance, that sometimes those don't match up. I would say a ballpark figure would be about 85% of the time, the clinical diagnosis before death matches up with the analysis of the neuropathologist after the person passes away. But about, maybe 10 to 15% of the time, they don't entirely agree. One of the things that brain donation has really helped us to understand why that is the case.
Okay.
And really, one of the key things that the field has learned over the last decade or two especially is that a person can accumulate the pathology that is seen in the brain, which are known as plaques and tangles.
Okay.
But especially those plaques of amyloid, you can see decades before a person might show cognitive problems or dementia. So the brain donations have really helped us to understand how early the process of Alzheimer's disease starts, even before a person or a family member would know that there are cognitive problems.
Okay. Now, what does it mean to say, so when you examine brain tissue after a person passes away, and maybe they've received a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or another dementia, and you're examining the brain, like, people have heard of maybe a person being diagnosed with mixed dementias. And what does that mean exactly? Yeah,
mixed dementias. So that's another common, if you will, condition that somebody could pass away with. And the idea with mixed dementia is they not only show the signs of Alzheimer's disease in the brain when they pass away.
Meaning the plaques and tangles.
Exactly, the plaques and tangles. But they also show additional conditions or diseases.
Okay.
Really the two most common ones that are often seen together with Alzheimer's disease when somebody passes away would be what they call vascular dementia. Okay. So evidence that there were some problems with the blood vessels that feed the brain, causing little areas of damage all scattered throughout the brain because of the blood vessel problem. So vascular dementia would be one. And then the second condition would be something called Lewy body dementia, which is associated with Parkinson's disease and motor problems as well. But those are the two most common that would be seen with Alzheimer's disease. And then the neuropathologic diagnosis would be a mixed dementia.
Okay. And can vascular and Lewy body dementia be seen on their own?
They can be, yes. So these are thought and believed to be independent processes. So they can happen independently without the others, or they can be seen together with the others.
I would imagine that while a person is alive, it'd be difficult to receive a clinical diagnosis, an accurate one, if they have mixed pathology.
It would be. So the clinicians, do an amazing job and are getting better and better at picking out the symptoms of the patients and what the likely disease process is. But there's a lot of overlap in dementias. And so it's hard to know with a particular symptom like forgetting their recent memories, whether that would be Alzheimer's disease or a vascular cause or something else.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
Now, getting back to the process of brain donation. So when a person who has decided to donate their brain passes away, what happens next? Like, how is the brain in the tissue collected?
Right.
What happens to the rest of the person's body?
Right. And so I think there's a lot of mystery and maybe some questions about that the audience might have about that as well. So typically, for the generous participants who are part of the study, they are the whole process is discussed and informed consent is obtained. And once a person passes away, typically then the next of kin or the primary care provider will contact one of our staff here. And because the tissue is most precious for research, the more, the fresher it is. And the more recent, as soon after death as possible. We have a very dedicated staff that, and there's always two people that carry pagers 24/7, 365, to coordinate the process of confirming the consent, arranging for transport service to come, arrange for the transport, to take them to the medical center, coordinate with the autopsy assistant, and to make sure that the brain donation process can occur in a timely fashion.
Okay.
And that's not unique to our center. We have a great record of that, but really the other, as you mentioned, 32 or so congressionally authorized Alzheimer's disease research centers, they all do really a fabulous job of doing that. And so it's really a credit to the system that we are able to get such precious and valuable research tissue.
Okay. Now, we do have a few questions here from our viewers, so I want to make sure that we get to those. One of the questions is, if beta amyloid plaque is a physical, I think means physical damage to the brain and cannot be reversed, why do the doctors say socializing and brain exercises can help slow it down? It's not like these activities will reduce the plaque or improve blood-brain barrier.
So that's so let me answer it in by analogy, and one of them would be atherosclerosis and heart disease. Okay. So especially for those of us like myself who sometimes don't eat as healthily as we should, we all develop plaques in our heart vessels starting from quite a young age, probably in our as early as our teens, but certainly in our 20s. Wow. So that starts the process, so in some ways you can think of that as being kind of a slowly progressing, inexorable process. On the other hand, there are things that we can do with our lifestyle that would actually slow the process down and ultimately could prevent you from getting a heart attack. So it's similar in that way with amyloid in the brain. It is almost certain that by the time you become older, that there could be plaques developing in the brain. But things like exercise, like diet, like other just healthy lifestyle choices, I think undoubtedly can slow down the process. And then there's the flip side of it as well. And sometimes we see this as neuropathologists, which is that a brain could be loaded with Alzheimer's disease type pathology, but the patient didn't have dementia during life. And so there's this concept of cognitive resilience, and that the brain is better able to withstand the disease process caused by the amyloid. And that's where things like exercise, cognitive exercise, health, diet, and lifestyle choices can, I think, make an impact. And that's something I think that the field is learning more and more about.
Yeah. Another question here is, we've talked about the donation of brains with Alzheimer's disease or other brain disease pathologies, but what's the value of a normal brain donation? Yeah,
I'm glad you asked that, Chelsea. That is
actually from one of our viewers. Great question.
Well, great question. So it is often the case, and this would be the case for all of the Alzheimer's disease centers around the country, probably the most challenging samples to get for a study are the normal so-called control samples. And I think it makes a lot of sense why that is the case. I think a lot of the participants who join Alzheimer's Disease Center studies have some concern about getting the disease. So they're more likely to have the signs and symptoms of that disease and the neuropathology ultimately. But to design a rigorous, well-controlled study, you need, as many control samples as you can get. So those can be extremely valuable for research, because often those are the types of samples that we have the fewest of.
Okay. Another question here is asking about ultrasounds on the brain. And I'll give you an opportunity to answer that question, Dr. Monuki, but also want to let that viewer know that our last Facebook Live episode was specifically on imaging, brain imaging for brain diseases. So that can be found on our Facebook page as well as our YouTube channel if you want to go back and view that. But do you have any comments on the use of ultrasound?
Ultrasound, right. So ultrasound is a very, very useful modality, increasingly becoming a modality that is done right at the bedside. Actually, I just learned of a fantastic ultrasound-based sort of a device that has been given to all of our first-year medical students this year, so that they each have a sort of a pocket ultrasound that they can use, which is fantastic. Now, the thing about ultrasound in the brain is that there's something called the skull. It gets in the way. It's really important, right? Because the brain's a little soft, and so it's really great that we have a hard skull, but it does make it nearly impossible to do ultrasound through the skull.
Okay.
So ultrasound wouldn't be the imaging modality of choice, certainly. But it's a great question. Yeah.
But MRIs and PET scans can be
correct.
used.
And that's increasingly being done. And I would say from being a neuropathologist as well, there's a lot more of interesting looking at radiology images, MRIs and PET scans, as you mentioned, and trying to match that up with what we're seeing after the person passes away.
Okay.
And there are many increasing number of studies, including studies we're doing here, to take the brain at postmortem and to do MRI imaging and those sorts of things on the brain tissue itself, the postmortem brain tissue, and that has revealed some very interesting things.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. Another question here: can changes to the frontotemporal lobe be detected using imaging prior to death from that type of dementia? And if so, do you think if those changes can be seen before? Do you think that those changes can be seen before symptoms become apparent?
Mm-hmm. So I am inferring from the question that they're speaking about a different type of dementia called frontotemporal dementia. That would be a distinct disease process from Alzheimer's disease. There are clues, certainly, in terms of the signs and symptoms that the patient would have before they pass away that might suggest to the neurologist that they do have indeed frontotemporal dementia, different patterns of cognitive problems. But currently, there's really not a definitive study, much like Alzheimer's disease, that can be done either with imaging or with biomarkers to definitively diagnose frontotemporal dementia before death. And again, so it's a situation where there are particular hallmarks that we can look at as neuropathologists to diagnose frontotemporal dementia as a distinct entity from Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. Another question here, if you want to comment, Dr. Monuki, is what types of exercise are best to delay amyloid plaque buildup process?
Yeah, great question. So I think the there's a lot of research going into these sorts of things. I know that there's both. You can think of physical exercise, cardiovascular exercise. The kind of trying to get your 30 minutes of cardiovascular activity 3 times a week, that type of thing. There's a physical aspect, but there's also the cognitive exercise, as they say, solving puzzles, crossword puzzles, those sorts of things that are more mental exercise. And I think the studies are still relatively in the early days, but I think there's evidence that both of those types of exercise can really be beneficial for delaying the progress of Alzheimer's disease, perhaps for increasing the resilience of the brain and the person. And so, I would say both those two general categories of exercise. It's not clear that a specific type of mental exercise, say, maybe is a New York Times crossword puzzle better than the LA Times crossword puzzle, or something like a Sudoku versus a crossword. Those sorts of types of things. It's not really clear. But what seems to be growing evidence is that some form of mental cognitive exercise is beneficial.
Doing something is probably better than doing nothing,
Right.
using your brain.
Right.
And in fact, I just want to add that UCI is a part of a site for a national clinical trial of exercise currently being led by Dr. Carl Kottman here at UCI Mind, and testing this very question, what type of exercise could possibly slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease.
That's exactly the focus.
So if you want to learn more about that, you can visit our website at mind.uci.edu. Another question here from a viewer. If a person is listed as an organ donor, so for example, on their driver's license, will UCI Mind have access to their brain? And are there steps to be taken to make it so? Great question.
So that's another great question. In many ways, brain donation is like an organ donation, but they're distinct, right? Organ donation, most people think about donating an organ to a living person to help save their life, and typically one other person. But sometimes, again, when someone passes away and when they're listed as an organ donor, they can potentially donate multiple organs to help save the lives of multiple people. In this case, we're talking about brain donation, not to save anybody's life, but to help the family in terms of, again, the diagnosis, establishing the diagnosis, but also contributing to the research process so we can make discoveries that will hopefully prevent this from happening one day. So it is a different process, and it requires a different type of consent. And so the organ donation consent that, I have that on my driver's license in my pocket also, that would not allow a person to necessarily donate their brain if they passed away for an Alzheimer's disease study.
Okay, so they couldn't do both.
They could do both,
could.
yes.
Okay.
Great clarification. Thank you, Chelsea. Yeah, no, absolutely, you can do both. But they just would require for the brain donation for an Alzheimer's disease, or again, a control type study. It would be a separate consent process to do it. But absolutely, you can do both.
Donate your brain to science and your organs to help save organs to help save lives.
That's right.
Another question here. Could you speak to the virus theory of Alzheimer's and how brain donation can help verify or not that hypothesis?
Yeah, that's great. The virus theory has been around for a long time, as have other theories. I think in terms of sort of the modern research avenues that get to those sorts of questions, the brain tissue, but the brain tissue can be used for a lot of sophisticated modern studies to look at molecular changes, molecules genes, proteins, and those sorts of things, and can be used to directly detect with very sensitive methods whether there is a presence of viral DNA or viruses. And so absolutely the brain tissue can be very important for those and very useful for those types of studies. And I should say that for the most part, as we've come to understand that, we think of ourselves as a single person with a single genome, but we realize that there's so many microbes. We talk about the microbiome, how many more organisms are actually part of us, particularly in our gut, but really elsewhere. That it's so as we've come to understand that as well, we can understand maybe the presence of some microorganisms that we wouldn't have expected to find in the brain, but that are present. So in addition to the brain science, I think it's our understanding of the entire body that helps us to interpret the findings. Say if somebody detected a viral genome in a brain tissue sample.
Very interesting. Great questions from our viewers today, and I just want to end on one final question, Dr. Monuki, which is just to ask, how you got started in this field. How did you come to be an Alzheimer's researcher and passionate about this work to try to end this disease?
Right. Well, I guess it's very interesting as a big part of what we do is also mentoring the next generation. And has always been interesting to me how circuitous the route is often for people. I guess I was maybe on the other side of the spectrum where it was always very clear to me that I wanted to study the brain. I guess the circuitous aspects of it were initially thinking about being a neurologist or a pediatric neurologist, but deciding that neuropathology was a fantastic career to combine both the clinical side as well as the research side, very synergistic. I initially started out as thinking mostly about developmental problems, so pediatric brain disorders and epilepsies and those sorts of things. But as is often the case in research, the different discoveries that we made along the way started to pique increasing interest in neurodegenerative conditions and things like Alzheimer's disease. And frankly, having such a fabulous Alzheimer's disease center here made it even easier to think about focusing some of my research attention on the end of life spectrum rather than the beginning of life.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I always love learning about how our faculty members and researchers have chosen to dedicate their lives to this health crisis, really, and doing everything that we can to try to solve it. So it's very inspiring. I want to just thank you again for your time joining us today. If you would like to learn more about Dr. Monuki's research or UCI Mind in general, you can visit our website at mind.uci.edu. And we will be addressing the topic of brain donation, among other critical topics in Alzheimer's research, at our 30th annual Southern California Alzheimer's Disease Research Conference, which will be held on October 25th at the Irvine Marriott Hotel in collaboration with our community partner, Alzheimer's Orange County. You can learn more about that at conference.mind.uci.edu.
Should be a fabulous conference.
Yes, looking forward to it. And then if you would like to learn more about how you can participate in research studies at UCI, such as the one I mentioned earlier, the EXERT study, the exercise clinical trial, we have many more. You can join the UC Irvine Consent to Contact Registry, or C2C, at c2c.uci.edu. So thank you very much again for all of those who attended live today, and to Dr. Monuki. And we hope to see you next month, the first Friday of October, which is October 4th. I will be joined by Dr. Malcolm Dick, who will he's a senior neuropsychologist here at UCI Mind, and he'll answer questions about changes in memory and when it's appropriate to seek medical advice from a doctor. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Great, thank you.